In many cases, if not most, the expansion was pretty much haphazard and unplanned, often driven by factors that European states found it difficult, if not impossible, to control. The activities, as I described them last time, of traders, missionaries and explorers that disrupted local political arrangements and getting into trouble with indigenous states and tribes from which they had to be rescued. The lights seem to have gone out. Are you happy with that?
Yes.
Okay, all right. Economic policies that brought state power in to open up closed areas to free trade, mostly dominated by the British. While the other European power with interest in Africa, apart from the British, French, and Germans, was Italy. Well, backed by Germany, the Italians got territory in the Horn of Africa to give them ports where Italian ships again could refuel before or after going through the Suez Canal. In the 1880s, they didn't have any real interest, however, in genuine colonies. I'll return to them in a moment to show how this developed a bit later on. But it's not really, the Italians are not really part of the scramble for Africa in the 1880s. So in any case, the partition of Africa by the end of the 80s was very largely a partition on paper only. It's reflected not least in the many artificial straight lines which formed the boundaries between colonies, protectorates and spheres of influence between the various European powers. Now you can see the Italians in the Horn of Africa, French got the desert there in the northwestern parts of the coast, Belgium Congo, something on its own, remaining Portuguese colonies in the south, and then a lot of dark-coloured British ones going down the eastern coast. Abyssinia remains unconquered, as does Liberia. One or two Spanish colonies there as well, mostly deriving from trading or coaling stations. Eastern and Southern Africa is mostly British and French. Minor adjustments remain to be made between the French and the British in northern Nigeria, the Upper Nile, Fashoda in 1898, where a military clash between the two powers was a distinct possibility, till the French, feeling rather inferior in military strength, prudently withdrew in the face of superior British forces. Here we are, the French at Fashoda being forced to abandon their claims. There's also Northern Africa, where Italy agrees with France on the settlement of claims in Libya, Morocco, 1900. But all intents and purposes, the scramble for Africa was over by the end of the 1880s and the kind of few postscripts in the 1890s. It's paralleled by a similar rush for influence and control in Asia and the Pacific, sparked in much the same way as Bismarck's claim over territory. Here it's New Guinea and the islands which became known as the Bismarck Archipelago. In 1885-6, the British and French recognised these claims in return for German acceptance of some British claims over part of New Guinea and the southern Pacific, and French claims over the eastern Pacific. There's another division of the spoils in 1898 when the Spaniards lose control over their possessions in the Pacific as a result of war with the USA. French troops came into Indochina in 1885-6 again to combat banditry, piracy and nascent uprisings, bringing Annam, Tonkin and Cambodia to go with Cochin China as existing French possession to single French colony ruled by a governor-general. Again, the British were looking rather askance at this, so they occupied Upper Burma in 1885, with Siam remaining independent as a kind of buffer zone. British and French were rivals in Madagascar, but standoff resolved in 1890 when the British recognised the French protectorate. So by this time, the rapid expansion of European empires is more or less complete by around about the 1890s. It's a global scale that happens above all in the 1880s in a very short space of time. It's not quite global, however. There's one major part of the world, you can see, that doesn't come under direct European rule. If you count out the Americas, which I talked about in an earlier lecture, but this expansion in Africa and in Asia certainly had its limits, and the major, most obvious one here is China. Now, the Chinese Empire, particularly after the Opium Wars, which I already talked about in this series, was generally thought to be decaying, ripe for chopping up. it had failed to resist European economic penetration enforced in the Opium Wars. It was rich, populous, promising in terms of economic exploitation and investment. And from 1850 to 1864, China was convulsed by what is in effect a civil war, the Taiping Rebellion. It's the largest war anywhere in the globe in the 19th century, the deaths of up to 20 million people. By the late 1860s, China was beginning to recover, but not before losing control over Manchuria to the Russians. From 1875, China was ruled by the Empress Dowager, though through her son, as she placed him under house arrest when he said he wanted to reform things. Here she is, the Empress Dowager. Deeply conservative, contrasting strongly with her Japanese equivalent, the Meiji Emperor, who was restored, in quotes, in a conflict between 1866 and 1870 by reformers, who decided that it's no use just sitting around, you've got to change things drastically, centralize Japanese government, consciously adopt Western technology, industry and institutions to prevent happening what was happening in China happening in Japan. In 1870, the teenage emperor, who was really just a figurehead here, received formal welcome, you see him in the middle, to emissaries of the Western powers who'd been banned from Japan during previous centuries. Japanese envoys set forth across the world to learn and import Western industrial, educational and political ways.
Hello Africans, hello all Africans and African Americans and African diaspora. I greet you. Shalom. Today we want to discuss one important thing, an important thing that is affecting Africa today, the Berlin Conference and the legacy of the Berlin Conference. The Berlin Conference is far much worse than we anticipated or than many of us think about it. Some of those people who really don't travel cannot feel the exact heat of the Berlin Conference, but some people who want to travel or people want to travel are facing these challenges. Right now, moving from one African country to another is so hard. There's an enmity between an African and an African, and there's a friendship between an African and the colonizer. Why is this happening? It's happening because in order to implement the Berlin Conference effectively, there had to be the divide and rule policy, which was very, very harmful to the African, not then, but also now. Yes, so let's dive into this video. I'll give you my thoughts by the end of the video.
All of this made possible by the advent of British, European, to some extent American, economic, technological and military superiority, against which states in other parts of the globe mostly found it increasingly difficult to compete. And it's this unplanned, haphazard but seemingly inexorable process to which the Cambridge historian Sir John Seeley referred when he made his famous statement that the British Empire was acquired in a fit of absence of mind. But already by the time he said this, in 1883, things were beginning to change. In fact, the publication of the very book in which he made this claim, The Expansion of England, was itself part of the change. Between 1878 and 1914, European empires grew even faster than they had before. Europe added more than 8,600,000 square miles to its overseas territories. By the outbreak of the First World War, these covered, including past colonies, 84% of the land surface of the globe. The overwhelmingly dominant colonial power through the first 3/4 of the century, Britain, second or third rank empires of France, Holland, Spain and Portugal, along with Russia with its rapid expansion in Central and Northeast Asia, these are joined in this period I'm talking about today by Belgium, Germany and Italy. So in the 1880s, Europe and the world entered what's been called the era of high imperialism. How do we explain this change? It's a rather sudden change in the 1880s from this haphazard acquisition of territories to this planned and deliberate scramble for them. I've called it, this lecture, The Scramble for Africa, but in fact, as I'll show, it covered other parts of the globe too. Well, over the decades, of course, beginning already before the First World War, a variety of explanations was advanced. Early on, writers like Hobsbawm, Lenin, Hobsbawm tends to follow Lenin in this explanation, and Rosa Luxemburg sought to ascribe economic causes to the expansion of Europe. They argued variously that colonies were needed, as they hadn't been previously, to provide raw materials for European industry, or markets for its products, or new areas in which to invest surplus capital in an era when monopolies and cartels were ossifying European capitalist economies and reducing profit margins. Alternatively, social democratic writers then and more recently have suggested, particularly in Germany, that the acquisition of colonies was used by conservative governments as a way of diverting rising working class discontent expressed in the growth of mass socialist parties which demanded the overthrow of capitalism, diverting that revolutionary impetus into nationalist and colonialist enthusiasm. This is the theory of social imperialism. In key European countries, so the argument goes, democratic or near-democratic franchises arrived in this period. So in France, there's universal adult suffrage, male suffrage since the 1850s. In Germany, it came in the late 1860s, then particularly with spread to the whole of Germany with Bismarck's new Reich in 1871. In Britain, it came with the Reform Acts of 1867 and 1884. All of these developments were, in this view, products of the rise of industry in Europe, resulting from the fact that industrialization, urbanization, the rise of the working class, shown here in a punch cartoon, the advent of mass politics, these are central features of the European scene in this argument by the end of the 1870s. But there's a real problem of timing here when we apply these theories to the period of the scramble for colonies in the 1880s, in the early to mid-1880s. Capitalism in Europe did not reach the stage of monopolies and cartels until the 1890s or even later. There's no convincing evidence that profit margins in Europe were declining in the 1880s. On the contrary, European economies are recovering from the sharp downturn of 1873 to 1875. The extension of the vote does not seem to have led to the rise of popular pressure groups for imperial acquisitions until after the turn of the centuries. In Britain, it's with the Boer War that it really, the famous jingoism movement, that popular enthusiasm for empire really takes grip. In the 1880s, also, European powers governments didn't seem to think that they needed to divert working class enthusiasm for revolution into enthusiasm for empire. On the contrary, they thought they could defeat socialism through repression. Bismarck's Germany, the socialist movement was banned from 1878 to 1890. In the early Third Republic in France, the 1870s and 80s, politics were still dominated by the repressive police atmosphere after the uprising of the Paris Commune in 1871. Key players in the imperial game, like Italy, had a very limited electorate. The working class weren't enfranchised there for this period. In the 1870s and 80s, the extension of the franchise in Germany was not accompanied by the rise of mass politics, which, again, didn't really come until the 1890s. So neither the economic nor the social imperialist theories really helped to explain what happened in the 1880s. Of course, on the general level, there certainly was a change in the international atmosphere. At the end of the 1870s, 1879, the German government ended the era of free trade by introducing import duties to protect domestic grain producers. That's the suppression of the Paris Commune, which shows you the kind of violence with which socialism was repressed in the 1870s, continuing in police measures up to the 1880s. Free trade ended as part of this more conservative turn in European governments in the 1870s. International rivalries certainly intensified as a steady expansion of European possessions overseas began to create collisions between European powers, for example, in West Africa between the British, the French, and the Belgians. And the growing penetration of indigenous economies by European merchants and traders that I've already talked about in this series of lectures increasingly produced crises on the ground where European powers felt they had to respond. But still, when all of this is said, when you look at these slightly more long-term developments, it does remain extraordinarily striking how quickly, how suddenly European powers decided to divide Africa and significant parts of the Pacific amongst themselves in the 1880s. And the key factor here, well, it's this chap. It's Bismarck, shown in a French cartoon here. Bismarck and his foreign policy. Now, Bismarck didn't actually like the idea of colonies at all for their own sake. He thought they'd lead to unnecessary trouble and expense. I am no man for colonies, quote unquote. But he did think the declaration of interests over particular areas, uncolonized areas of the world, particular potential colonies, if you like, could be a useful bargaining chip in the European power game. He was obsessed in the 1870s and 80s with trying to make sure that his achievement in uniting Germany in 1871 was not overturned by rival powers, particularly France. As he said to an explorer in 1888, "Your map of Africa is really quite nice, but my map of Africa lies in Europe. Here is Russia, and here is France, and we're in the middle. That's my map of Africa." In 1883, Bismarck's intervention in an already volatile colonial situation turned a set of existing problems into a mad scramble for territory. Now, of course, rivalries and interventions had been building up. Key underlying factor here is the gradual decay of Ottoman power, already severely dented by the French conquest of Algeria in 1830. The Ottoman Empire originally stretched from Turkey and Anatolia through the Middle East and right along the whole region of North Africa. And it had been chipped away bit by bit through the 19th century. The French had acquired Algeria in 1830. In Tunisia, next door, the more or less autonomously governing local Ottoman official known as the Bey, B-E-Y, he's in a magnificent official uniform, borrowed heavily from European banks to try and modernize his country. But he borrowed it's a familiar story, isn't it? He borrowed too much and he couldn't repay the debts. So in 1857, the British and French consuls, joined later by the Italians, got the power of supervising his administration, which passed in 1869 to an international financial commission. His job it was to oversee the Tunisian debt. Problem was that the Beys, it's another familiar story here actually, the Beys government was unable to pay taxes. Nobody wanted to pay them, just like in Greece today. So European powers, at the same time, European powers forced down Tunisian import tariffs until they're so low, there's about 3%, that the country was flooded with European exports and its own industry began to collapse. So this twin problem of not being able to collect taxes and the economy declining led to increasing jockeying for position amongst the three powers on the Commission. And then it all exploded when the Italians announced they were going to annex Tunisia. This prompted the French to send their army from Algiers to Tunis in 1881, which led to a Muslim rebellion, which led to complete French occupation, though the Bey continued on as local ruler. Here we are, 1881, the French invasion of conquest of Tunisia. Remember, they seized it from the Ottoman Empire, and the decay of Ottoman control in North Africa opened up further sources of conflict between the European powers. With relatively few resources, the desert province of Libya remained under control of the Ottomans throughout the century. Unlike today, nobody seemed to want to invade it. But Egypt was far richer in resources, especially cotton. Under the Khedive Mehmet Ali, it had become independent by the late 1840s. Mehmet Ali was fully committed to economic modernization. He imported European specialists to try and help. And in 1854, as part of this program, the government commissioned a former French consul, Ferdinand de Lesseps, to set up a company to build a canal across the Suez Isthmus. Here's a construction in process. It employed over 1.5 million workers. and it lasted 15 years. Canal opened in 1869, was fully completed 2 years later. Here's another hugely expensive investment, and it didn't make a lot of money to start with. And Mehmet Ali's the successor, the Khedive Ismail, had invested so much money in it that he went bankrupt in 1878. And the inevitable debt commission, dominated by the French and British, was set up to sort things out. And when Mehmet started causing troubles, when Ismail started causing trouble, he was simply deposed and replaced by a more pliant successor. That's a familiar pattern. And it sparked, again, as in Tunisia, a widespread revolt led by a senior officer in the Egyptian army, Colonel Arabi, whose followers resented growing non-Muslim interference in Egyptian affairs and the behavior of the new puppet Khedive, who was seen as rather dictatorial. Here's the rather dramatic picture of the Arabi revolt. Put down at the Battle of Tel el-Kebir here by a British force in 1882, since the French National Assembly, probably wisely, refused to grant credits for a French expedition. So the British are effectively drawn into occupying Egypt on their own through suppressing this revolt, which endangers the Suez Canal. And they stayed on then because another revolt began in Sudan, launched by the Muslim holy man, the Mahdi, which threatened to explode cross into Egypt again. This is the uprising that led in 1885 to the famous incident of the death of General Gordon at the Sudanese capital of the Khartoum. Gordon was an officer in the Egyptian army working for Ismail Pasha. He's not a British officer. But nevertheless, the British sent an expeditionary force to rescue him. He came too late, it withdrew, Sudan was left in peace. Egypt did not become a British colony, but it remained under the Debt Commission's control, and this is now the site of increasingly irritated Anglo-French rivalry, stirred up by the Germans, of course, who had a seat on the Commission as well. So, Anglo-French clashes then in North Africa, and these are exploited in 1884 by Bismarck, who backs the French. It's Bismarck's aim to draw the French away from thoughts of revenge over Germany for the loss of Alsace-Lorraine by encouraging them to seek imperial conquest elsewhere and to be more ambitious in North Africa. And he also thought, rather strangely, that this would demonstrate to the British how desirable it was to have the Germans as their friends and to be nice to them. So it's rather strange backing the French trying to persuade the British that they should be nice to the Germans. There's also elections coming up in the Reichstag. Bismarck needed the support of the powerful national liberals who were allied to mercantile trading interests in Hamburg and elsewhere. So he began now in 1884 to claim colonies, or rather to declare a German protectorate over key areas. Anglo-Pequena in southwest Africa with a German flag. It was raised in May 1884, a slightly fuzzy contemporary picture. There they are raising the flag. Then Togoland of the Cameroons in West Africa in July 1884. Bismarck declares a protectorate over New Guinea in December 1884. East Africa, Tanganyika in February 1885. There's a whole string of them. And he signed a treaty with the King of Samoa, giving Germany preferential rights in Samoa over other European powers. The King thought it prudent to sign when he saw a German warship at anchor off the island. Typically, the moving forces on the ground here are explorers. There's Gustav Nachtigall in West Africa and Karl Peters, I'll come back to him in a minute, in East Africa. It's explorers like those two, it's traders and planters, particularly in New Guinea, but they're all there was. They're not followed by any significant involvement by the German state. Bismarck simply signs a piece of paper saying, I declare a protectorate for Germany over Anglo-Pequena and Tanganyika, and that's about it. And so what he did by this is to demonstrate that you didn't actually need to occupy a territory in order to annex it. He didn't even bother to send troops, apart from a little expedition to raise the flag. And this, of course, persuaded everybody that annexation was much easier than, and much cheaper than they thought it might be. And this string of annexations and protectorates declared by Bismarck created something like a panic as European states rushed to annex their own favoured territories before someone else got there first. To underline his friendship with France, he agreed with the French government to call a conference in Berlin on colonial claims, which met from November 1884 to February 1885. Here it is. It's Bismarck, you can see there sort of at the bottom of the right of the big picture in the background, talking animatedly to somebody. Now, this focused in practice almost entirely on the Congo, where it recognised the claim of Leopold II, King of the Belgians, to treat it as his own private property. It also ratified the French claim to the northern bank of the Congo River, but apart from this, it achieved absolutely nothing. This is not the place where the scramble for Africa is all sorted out, in other words. It's very limited. But its declaration, the conference declared that a claim to a colony required effective occupation, caused some alarm, so therefore all the powers simply ignored it. In any case, effective occupation applied only to coastal areas. And they also ignored its insistence that free trade had to be applied to major rivers like the Congo or the Niger. Still, by laying down some ground rules, even if they were ignored in practice, the conference effectively declared the scramble had begun. So the mere fact of a conference being held on colonial possessions, the first one, international conference, sort of was like the starting pistol fired to get going. So, in 1885, the British declared a protectorate over the Nigerian coast, and the French rivalry with Britain, stimulated by the quarrels over Egypt, led its local administrators in West Africa to push forward with the idea of an empire stretching from Algeria to the Congo. 1889 to 90, they signed treaties with the British defining the boundaries of the two sets of possessions, all only on paper, because the hinterland in West Africa, for example in northern Nigeria, is controlled by quite powerful and well-organized Islamic states. While the poor old Germans were stuck with Togo and Cameroon and southwest Africa, since neither Bismarck nor any German merchant firms had any real interest in going further. These are, again, for Bismarck, these are pawns in the diplomatic game. In East Africa, however, East Africa, Tanganyika, this formidable character, Karl Peters, explorer, founded the Society for German Colonization, concluded treaties in its name with a variety of local rulers in 1884. And he wasn't happy with Bismarck's reluctance to declare colonies, protectorates, and involve the German state. So he effectively blackmailed him. He went to Bismarck and said, look, if you don't give a charter for my East Africa company, I'll sell everything in East Africa to King Leopold. Well, that was something that Bismarck didn't want. He wanted the support of the National Liberals, who backed Peters and gave in. Soon, Peters went back to Africa in 1885 and started annexing territory all over the place, and the British actually had to expel him from Uganda because he was about to annex Uganda. But he got into really bad trouble when the activities of his company led in 1889 to a revolt by Arab planters, which the German government, supported by the British, rather reluctantly sent troops to suppress, which then led to the declaration of a German East Africa as a full colony under German state control. And then a deal was done at the same time whereby Heligoland is a kind of rock in the North Sea just off the German coast with a couple of small settlements on it, was British possession. That became a German possession, and Zanzibar became a British possession. Peters is pretty well finished by stories of his scandalous behaviour reaching Germany, particularly in 1892, when it became known that he'd had one of his African mistresses, Yogodia, hanged when he discovered she was having an affair with his manservant, Mabruk, and the manservant was hanged too, and both their home villages were burnt to the ground, which led to a local revolt, which again German troops had brought in to suppress. Peters was recalled home, 1897, dishonourably discharged from government service with the loss of his pension rights. He only escaped criminal prosecution, like so many continental criminals in those days, by fleeing to London.
So guys, today in Africa we have up to 54 countries, and maybe in the future we might even have more countries in Africa and other parts of the world. But for the sake of this video, I'm going to minimize our scope to this continent, Africa. The other day we heard that white people wanted to take the Cape Town part of South Africa and make it a country independent of the main South African country. The other day in 2011, we saw South Sudan get away from Northern Sudan. We saw all that happening. And right now, where I am right now, Kenya, we have Uganda, we have Tanzania, we have this and that. We didn't have this in the past. In the past, we never had these names. These names came later on when the colonizer came. He brought his way of division. Divide and conquer. Divide and conquer policy is a very lethal weapon of the enemy. That is the #1 weapon he uses. Actually, the other day I was watching a video. Yesterday I was watching a video. Depends with which yesterday when you watch this video. So there's a video which was done by Wodemaya, and there's a specific part that really intrigued my head. You know, there's this girl. She was traveling from London to Nigeria. That's a very, very long journey from London to Nigeria, solo, with a very small car. And the issue is not about small car or solo. That's another part of the story. But she said that journeying through Europe, she didn't have any matters along the borders. And she's black. She didn't have any matters along the European borders until she touched the soil of Africa. When she touched the soil of Africa is when things started getting very, very serious. The borders. Africans are too hard on Africans. Africans don't realize the person who brought this division, where he is, or where he went back to, or where he came from. They don't have that border thing. They don't have it. They have borders, yes, but they can't prevent you from getting to one place or one another. They believe they are one people, you know. And so this woman was saying how much it was hard to move from one African country to another. It was a lot of struggle, a lot of money being paid, you know. And it was crazy amounts being paid, especially in the borders of Ghana. She paid crazy amounts of money to cross that country. Why should an African pay to go to an African country? Why should you pay? You should only pay for your accommodation and transport. Yeah, people are so much afraid that it will bring harm to Africans, or other Africans will bring bad behaviors to their countries. No, all country has their own people who have their own bad behaviors, and that's normal. And so this border policy, which is a result of the Berlin Conference, is really a painful thing for the Africans. It's really a thing that Africans, we should go back and ask ourselves, this borderless policy, do we really want it? Do we really need these borders as the white man placed them? One side of Africa is Anglophone, the other side is Francophone, another side Spanish, another side Portuguese, another side Arabic. Why all this? Why should an African be hard on a fellow African? It is because of the Berlin Conference. The Berlin Conference was held by the German Chancellor by then. His name was Otto von Bismarck. And we had the international people, we had the community of human rights back then, you know, and they were asked, this Berlin Conference, what's interesting about it? What's your take on it? What's the end game with this Berlin Conference? Whites were asking whites, because I believe we also had people who had humanity inside them. We had people who wanted to exploit Africa, and we had people who are human up to now, you know. Even in Sodom and Gomorrah, not everyone was gay. In Sodom and Gomorrah, there's a man who was God-fearful, and this person was called Lot, you know. Now, it follows that Africa had different countries, had different sectors, like the Congo Forest, the Nile River, the Lake Victoria, Mount Kilimanjaro, this and that. The white man was very smart. He realized that Africa was a very rich country, and they were fighting each other. They were shedding each other's blood on an African soil because of their white supremacist agenda, because they wanted to keep the energy of superiority. They didn't want the African to see that they are vulnerable. They didn't want an African to see this person also has weakness. Because according to Africans, this one was according to Kinjekitile Ngwale in Tanzania. He was a witch doctor. He really lied to his people that we can go and fight the Germans and I will pour some magic formula on you. This magic formula will make you bulletproof. He brainwashed his people. That's another thing about religion. He brainwashed his people and they were shot. The magic formula was never ever bulletproof. They were shot and they died. It follows that Kinjekitile Ngwale and his people believed that the white people cannot die. You know, he believed that the white people cannot die, and so he thought maybe they were using some kind of magical powers, and so he wanted to fight magic with magic. He decided to use the water and the millets, water from a river in Tanzania called River Rufiji. He took some water from this and took some millet and sorghum flour, mixed it and poured on his warriors. The warriors were told, now you'll be bulletproof, you can go and fight for your land against the Germans, you know. And Africans were rising and rising and rising and rising. We had Africans who resisted. Yes, they resisted, say, no, we don't want this. We have Africans who collaborated. The scramble for Africa was not easy. Some Africans betrayed some Africans. Some Africans resisted these white people. Yes, even here in Kenya we have tribes that resisted. We have tribes that collaborated. They collaborated by giving information about other communities to them. They collaborated by providing intel that will make other communities vulnerable to attack. You see? So, white people were fighting themselves and it was not a good image. They thought, no, these Africans should not see us fighting. We should not shed our own blood on this continent. They will see us as weak. So Bismarck, as wise as he thought he was, he decided to call his people to Berlin in 1865-66. Can't remember the exact date, but between 1865 and 1866. You get me? Bismarck now came up front and they divided Africa. North Africa, some sectors belong to the British, some sectors belong to the French. East Africa, most part belonged to the British. Tanzania was colonized by the Germans. Congo Free State was taken by Leopold. Leopold insisted that he wanted Congo State. He insisted, I want Congo. You know what happened next? 10 million Africans were killed in the Congo because of Leopold. Nobody could stop Leopold. A lot of Africans died in the hands of Leopold. But when you go to the West, Leopold is praised. He is seen as a warrior by those white people. Some of them, not all of them. He is seen as a warrior. But here we see them as, no, he is not a warrior. He killed 10 million people. The Belgians in Congo. Now, they left their legacy in Congo. Right now, Congo is never stable. Congo is never ever stable. They're always fighting one another. Civil war here, civil war there. What does that tell you? The impact of the Berlin Conference. Sometimes it's easier to study a parasite. There you will know how to treat the disease it causes. The parasite here is the colonizer who brought this. The disease here is the colonization and the neo-colonization. Imperialism, modern imperialism we are experiencing today. Today we have Africans being imperialists to fellow Africans because they are continuing the legacy of deceit, the legacy of the Berlin Conference. It's a good thing that the brother, the white brother, has able to share important details about things on the Berlin Conference. The Berlin Conference really affected Africans, really. But they concealed it. They concealed. They said, no, we are not affecting Africans. Actually, we are doing humanitarian works and all that. No, it's no humanitarian work. Right now, even where I'm sitting right now, if I want to go to Uganda, I'm thinking of papers. Loads of papers. Here, Uganda here. Just here in Uganda. For example, if this car wants to go to Uganda, it will cost a lot. It will. But if it's a white man's car, it might not even cost anything. They'll just go. Africans have been taught by the white person who was the colonizer to hate on fellow Africans to continue the legacy of the Berlin Conference. It is the worst decision that has ever happened in the course of humanity. I don't know everything. Maybe you know some things, and maybe I've not covered everything, or maybe the brother was not able to cover everything. Do share your thoughts and comments on the comment section. Share your thoughts. Your feedbacks are all accepted. Remember, stay African and support the channel. Subscribe. Support me on Patreon. Subscribe. Be a member of this channel. See you in the next video. Stay African.